And so we're going to begin. I'd like to begin this evening with a meditation on the breath. And just to say a couple of words about that. Oftentimes we might hear the instruction to uh, follow the whole breath, but then you don't know how to do that. You're only catching one part of it or another. So the point of this way of doing the meditation that I'm going to share with you this evening is just to help you to begin to identify the different aspects of the breath that you might tune into. And the other thing that I want to say about that is that if you feel any tendency, any kind of tightness or anxiety, or you feel a tendency to control the breath, then the best thing to do for that is to actually feel the breath in the lower abdomen rather than in some other part of the body. It's really okay wherever you would like to sense it, wherever you feel the sensations. But I just give that as a suggestion. Lowering the attention can help to lower that tendency to sort of cling to the breath. All right. So with that, you can begin sensing the weight of the body on your seat. Sometimes I like to rock a little bit from side to side or front to back. Just loosen up any tension. Allow the body to find its natural, balanced, upright posture. Relaxing the belly, really allowing yourself to settle right here in this place. And allowing the muscles of the ribs and the chest to also just relax and widen. Softening the eyes, softening the mouth. And then beginning to settle your attention on the sensations of the breath. Wherever you feel them, maybe at the tip of the nose or at the back of the throat. In the chest, the diaphragm, or the abdomen. Just noting the sensations of the breath, breathing the body naturally. And in particular, beginning to observe the pauses between the parts of the breath. No need to make them any longer or shorter. Just being present for them. All sorts of other thoughts and perceptions are happening in the mind. And you can just let them recede into the background as you rest the attention on the sensations of the breath, aware those natural moments of pause in between. Staying curious about those pauses between the breaths. And having noticed those pauses in between the breaths, you might notice the beginnings of inhalations and exhalations. You stay for the pause, no matter how long or short it is, and then observe the beginning of the next part. Resting the mind on the sensations of the breath. Aware of those natural moments of shifting from the stillness to the beginning of inhalation or exhalation. Moments of impermanence. So nice that we get to just be right here in this moment. Resting the mind on the breath. And having found the beginnings of each part of the breath, then you can rest the mind along the length of the breath. Just riding along, however long or short it is. Noticing that there too is impermanence, shifting all along the length of the breath. Lovely. That was our meditation for this evening. Now, just going to make a couple of changes here in the room, and we'll transition to the Dhamma talks. I'll begin with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Good evening again, everyone. So yesterday I was having a conversation with one of the sanghas in Bangkok, in Thailand, and we were having a conversation that ultimately ended up being something about belief. What is it that people believe is happening when they wake up, or when they die, or in various other circumstances? We were having this conversation about belief, and it occurred to me as I was reflecting on that today that actually, although what is happening in our minds is certainly important, more telling, I would say, is how our actions are actually demonstrating what we believe. And at this time right now, particularly in American society, but in general, I would say, it's a very interesting dynamic that's happening. It's maybe interesting is even a euphemism there. It's sometimes inscrutable, the activity, the way that there seems to be sometimes a belief that is being acted out that isn't being reflected upon. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about what is the way that the Dhamma talks about the difference between belief or trust or confidence and action. And what is the role of intention in all of that as well. So that's a big juicy topic, and we probably won't cover all of it. But example that I want to start with, and there are a couple of different examples that I'm going to mention, but the example that I want to start with is from my time at the monastery out in California. So a couple years back, I was living at Aloka Vihara monastery, Theravada nuns monastery in northern Cal, about halfway between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe, if you know that part of the geography. And so we would go to the farmers market on Saturdays, most Saturdays, depending on what was going on. We'd go to the farmers market and collect food donations. That's very traditional Theravada. We have, I don't know if you can see, I know because of the way the camera is today, you can't really see my bowl behind me, but that big metal monastic bowl. We walk around and invite people to make food offerings. And rather than walking, what we decided to do there at a local vihara was we would go to the farmers market and we would stand what's called standing for alms at the farmers market. And some of you know that I wrote some things about this in a book that is available by free distribution if you're interested. And in the book, I talk about this gentleman named Gerardo. So Gerardo was one of the farmers who came to the farmers market. And he would drive easily 2.5 hours from his home in the Central Valley of California up to Placerville, California, to come to this farmers market on Saturdays. And his was one of the bigger stands there. It wasn't a very large market, but not as big as Eastern Market in DC, for example, for folks who are local here. But it was a pretty substantial market nonetheless. And Gerardo had this big stand with all this beautiful produce that he and his family had grown on their farm there in the Central Valley. Mind you that, just to mention the inequity of all that he had worked that land for 12 years, leasing the land. And he didn't own that land. And the reason why he didn't own that land was because the cost of leasing the land kept going up such that he could never get ahead enough to actually buy the land that he'd worked. He and his whole entire family had worked for years and years and years. But nonetheless, Gerardo was not a bitter man at all. And it was very, very wonderful to connect with him when we would go on Saturdays. And so usually we'd go 2 by 2. So I would often go with Ayya Ahimsa, this other nun who lived there at the monastery. And so Ahimsa and I would be standing there. And Gerardo would come over. I think the first time he met us, he sort of, introduced himself and such. And then he asked us, "Do you pray?" And she said yes, and I said no. Right? Because it depends on what you mean by prayer, right? If you're talking about like what he probably means by prayer, which is "Dear God" or "Dear Virgin Mary," no, we don't do that. But do we pray? Well, yes, in another way, we sort of do, right? We chant, we invoke various beings. We invoke our own intentions and so on. And so I said, so ultimately I said, okay, we pray, but not in the same way. And so he said, okay. And he asked us a few more questions. And then he tilted his head kind of, and he said, "Okay, you're doing good." And he gave us some tomatoes. Okay, great. And that was the start of a lovely relationship. And then one day we were standing there having a little chat with Gerardo, and he would ask us, "Oh, are you receiving any offerings today?" And it's like, well, you can see what's in our bowls, right? It's like my Zen master's master used to ask him all the time, "What are you doing?" And he was like, "You can see what I'm doing." But it wasn't about that, right? It was about thinking about what's going on. So we would say, "Yes, we're receiving some lovely offerings today." And he would say, "Okay, great." And this time, instead of handing us some tomatoes, he said, "Can I have this bag?" And we had brought these big, like shopping bags with us in case we had a tremendous bounty of offerings. And, we sort of paused for a second because it doesn't belong to us as monastics. Our robes, our bowls, and some personal things, maybe some books, are the things that belong to us. Everything else belongs to the monastery. Yeah. So it's not mine to give away, really, if that's what he's asking. But nonetheless, I said, okay, sure. If he really needs it, then by all means, give the man a bag. And maybe he doesn't, he's just borrowing it. So sure enough, he went over to his stand and he filled up the whole bag to the brim with the produce right off the tops of his piles, like not the little produce that he had on the side, which is a little bruised, or the stuff that was, going to go bad the next day that he was selling, that he wasn't even selling. Actually, he would just move it off to the side. No, he took the best produce off the best piles and he filled up the bag and he came over with this huge grin on his face and handed us this bag full of food. And he started doing this every single week. He became our biggest benefactor in terms of food. Now, mind you that this man is not Buddhist. He's not Buddhist. And he probably doesn't really know that much about Buddhism or what Ayya Himsa and I were doing, He would ask us, what do we, how are things or whatever? And we would say something like, oh, we were on a meditation retreat last week and that's why we weren't here. Or, Ahimsa was the one responsible for the property. So she would talk about stuff that she was doing on the land. We took some trees out for fire reasons But there was something that was touched in him that he felt when we were together. And it was very clear. It was very clear that there was something more going on for him. And so he was Seventh-day Adventist. He'd actually talked to us a little bit about having changed from being Catholic to being Seventh-day. And was he trying to convert us? I'm quite sure he was not trying to convert us, right? It's not about that. But was he just living out his Seventh-day Adventist values about compassion and things? I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether he was or not. I think there was more to it than that. I really do. One day he showed up and he didn't have his usual red shirt on. He had a blue shirt on. And he said, look, my daughter went on spiritual retreat and I went with them and I was the chaperone and, I go and keep the kids out of trouble and so on. And it wasn't until later that I realized, oh, he's saying he also goes on retreat, right? So there was an affinity there that developed where he was living into his values, but he was also living into some other sense of connection, some other sense of understanding that he's demonstrating his inner connection with us by this generosity that he's giving. Yeah. And that was beautiful. That was beautiful to see the joy that brought him every single week, how much fun he would have filling up the bag. And, no matter what time of year it was, we'd go at the beginning of the farmer's market, when they didn't have that much produce yet. It's still the harvest hasn't yet happened. Or we'd go toward the end and he had basically like cabbages and that's all he had, cabbages and scallions or something, whatever it was that would grow in the cold. And, but it was beautiful. And it was very much about the action for him, that he felt he could take this action. This were the resources that he had put his love into that sort of represented him. And that was a way that he could demonstrate his affinity. And in fact, when we came, so we had a long break and the farmers market stopped for a while for COVID. And then we saw him again when the market opened up for a little while. We thought there were these starts and stops, and we thought that it was going to stop for long enough. And we saw him, and he leaned over to me again, and he's like, "I hope you're praying." Right, recalling that initial conversation, and coming to some shared understanding about what that meant. What does it mean to be praying? So trying to help the world. I think that's what it means for him, trying to help the world. And he was certainly doing that. You know, his bags of food were also his prayers. Were also his prayers. So there's that kind of action. There is a kind of action which is very much living into, or you could say, demonstrating a deeper understanding about what's happening. But if it, even when that's happening, I would say, but especially when it's not happening, then we need to think about our ability to reflect on our impacts. And this is another issue that's very much up socially, which is for us to be, for everyone to be able to begin to recognize the impacts of what they do and say, and reflect on that in such a way that they can question, is this really in alignment with what I believe and what I mean to do? And the example that I'll give you of that is when Dave's not here this evening, but our friend Dave, who is often here on Tuesday nights, he is an Indian man, and he has two places of residence. He has one place out in West Virginia, and he has a place here in Alexandria, which is in some kind of like a condo or an apartment building, some kind of shared space. And he went into the mail room to go get his mail, and one of the delivery people there saw him and started talking to him as if he were another delivery person, just assuming automatically that he didn't live in that building. Or Dave says he will walk into a restaurant here in Alexandria, and nobody will ask him if he wants a table, if he needs a table. They think that he's there. They're like, here's the takeout. He's like, I'm not the takeout person. I'm not the DoorDash person. Okay. So those folks could stand to reflect more on what's happening in that situation, right? It's a very quick, it might be something that to them is like, oops, oh, whatever, and they, right, go on with their day. Or maybe, I would hope that they're reflecting on what happened there, on the impacts, the potential impacts of that kind of an interaction with somebody like Dave, who is, you know, a professional and a person, even if he wasn't a professional, you know, a person who could walk into the restaurant and be served just like anybody else. You know? So these are the kinds of reflections that we really need to begin to think about as well, reflecting on impacts of our actions. So there's the reflecting before, which is a little bit about what I was saying, I think Gerardo was doing, reflecting before and actually kind of enacting one's values. And then there's the potential for some reflection after. And as the Buddha said to his son Rahula, when his son was actually 7 and was a monk at that time, had just gone forth, according to the commentaries, you can reflect during, actually, while those kinds of things are happening, while our actions of body, speech, and mind are taking place. We can begin to think through, what is the belief that we're demonstrating here? And oftentimes, we might find something that is a little bit dissonant or something that surprises us. We often might find that we don't live up to our ideals. And there are lots of reasons for that. I would suggest many different reasons. One reason is everybody's doing it. That's how our society does things. So an example of that I'll give you from ancient times is from the Therigatha, so from the verses of the elder awakened women of the Buddha's time. There's a woman named Hunika. Actually, it just means slave, Huna. And she was a slave. She was owned by Anathapindika's family. Anathapindika was a very wealthy person who was a very devout follower of the Buddha, actually, and gave the land on which the Buddha and the monastics stayed. And yet Puna speaks about this. So this is a very interesting poem that she gives. So these verses, hers happens to have 16 verses, so I won't go through the whole thing in detail, but I want to go through the beginning of it because this is relevant to our topic here. And so she's speaking to a Brahmin. She's speaking to someone who is in the upper level, in the top of what were at that time four castes, four categories in the social strata of India. And she's at the bottom. She's a slave. And she might even be below the bottom, actually, now that I think about it out loud, but I don't know. I'm not sure. In any event, she says, I carried water even when it was cold. I still went down into the water, afraid of the sticks of my mistresses. So this is Charles Hallisey's translation. Hallisey is an academic, and so he has a particular way of translating these that isn't necessarily the view of a practitioner, and sometimes that's helpful, actually. I think he does a very good job. Most of the time, I like to use his translation. Afraid of the sticks of my mistresses, afraid of their words and their anger. So clearly, Puna, or Punika, means the same thing, was not being treated very well there in Anathapindika's house. So there's some discrepancy, actually. It's a very interesting fact, right? That she is in the household of someone who is a follower of the Buddha, who's a very strong supporter of the Buddha, somebody who is who is practicing, and yet there are other things happening within the household that don't reflect that. But anyway, she's there. She's at the river in the cold, and she says, "What are you afraid of, Brahman? When you go into the water, your body shivering as you feel the biting cold." In other words, why do you have to be here? I have to be here because I have to be here. I'm a slave. The alternative is not good. But why are you here? And he says, so now this is an interesting line. So Charles Hallisey translates the line, even though you know me, Punika, but other folks have translated it as just you know, Punika, and yet you still ask why I'm doing this skillful act, blocking the fruits of evil already done. Anyone who does an evil act, whether old or young, is freed from the fruits of that evil act by washing off in water. So now this was one of the beliefs of the Brahmins of that time, that particular spiritual tradition that the Brahmins carried. And they had their belief system, and they were enacting that. And then Puna says, "Who told you that?" Like a know nothing speaking to a know nothing is how Charles translates it. It's like the blind leading the blind, like the blind leading the blind. That one is freed from the fruits of an evil act by washing off in water. Is it that frogs and turtles will all go to heaven? So that's what she asks him. Is it that frogs and turtles will all go to heaven? So will the water monitors and the crocodiles and anything else that lives in the water, as will the thieves, the executioners, etc. Can you really be freed? She says, are they freed from the fruits of their evil acts if these rivers can just carry away that? And if so, then would they not carry away the good too? So she really challenges him to think about that belief system and the impacts of that belief system, right? That's why she brings up. So on the one hand, she's using some humor and she's being quite cheeky with him and particularly brave, courageous, given the fact that, again, their, sort of social standing is quite different. And on the other hand, she's being also, quite logical with him. Like, think through what you're doing there. Does that really make sense? And is that the message that we want to give people? So ultimately, he listens to her. He listens to her teaching, and ultimately, actually, Anathapindika frees her, and she becomes one of the Sangha. She ordains and is said to become a fully awakened arahant, arahanti. And it is because of her right view. It is because of she started out with the proper understanding about the impacts of actions. And from that point, then she's able to examine what's really going on. And this is an important aspect of the Dhamma. So it's not that the Dhamma doesn't ask us to believe things. The Dhamma certainly will say things to you that you may not have experienced. Going back to what I was talking about in terms of like the Bangkok Sangha. And maybe you decide that you're willing to have that belief, or you're willing to have some confidence or some trust in that. But interestingly, what the Buddha told people again and again is look at the results of what you do. Does it bring more greed? Does it bring more hatred? Does it bring more ignorance, more confusion to you, to others, to both, into the world, or less? Because you can tell. And that is one of the most beautiful parts of the Dhamma. Yeah. That the Dhamma is predicated on a trust, a basic trust in each one of us and our ability to make choices, our ability to discern, our ability to work with what we have in front of us. And by virtue of that, then to go deeper and deeper into the nature of reality. But we start at this very, very gross level. Is it going to create more greed, more hatred, more delusion? Pretty straight up. So this is the kind of thing that we need to ask ourselves about our own actions, about our own speech, about our own thought process. And the other thing, just to begin to close up, the other thing, though, that I want to mention is that oftentimes people also say, well, I can't because of the past. I do because of the past. And there is certainly something to be learned from the past. There is no question about that. In fact, again, that is one of the reflections that is being recommended. And but we are not trapped by the past. That's not the understanding of the workings of karma. The choices you make matter, and you do have choice. It's very interesting that there seems to be in some circles of Buddhism these days some question about whether there is volition or not. And I think that stems from a basic misunderstanding about, or a basic like creeping in of the sense of self. So I think we're all pretty much on board that, for example, that perceptions can happen just because that's the mechanism of what the body does. When something comes into your sound, when a sound comes to your ear and you're able to attend to it consciously, then there is consciousness and there is a perception of that sound. You may not know what it is. You may not be able to have a good word for it, or you might. But perception can happen without the sense of self. It's just a mechanism that is occurring there. And similarly, the same thing is true about sankharas, about the volition. There is a mechanism there that is happening, and we invoke that mechanism by making choices, and we can certainly make choices that go against our conditioning. We can certainly do that. There's no question about it. There's no question about it. I think that some of the argument that's being made is, no, it's all just conditioning and that's just a new conditioning. But I would say, no, actually, we are able to make choice. That's why that is fundamental to the teaching of right view, that we are able to enact our intentions. And by that, we are sort of activating certain energies in our future. So the example I want to give of that is about not being trapped by the past is that when I was a young girl, I had gone to my mom. I don't remember how old I was. But anyway, we were renting this house that didn't have grass in the back. It was just, the yard was just a total mess. And it was all grown up with weeds and stuff. But some of the weeds had these really pretty flowers on them. And so I thought, I'm going to give my mom some of these flowers. So I picked a bunch of flowers and I made them into a little bunch. And I went to go give the flowers to my mom. And my mom was like, "What are these weeds? I don't want this." And she threw it in the trash. And I remembered it for years. I felt like it was a very sad moment for me, or a very harsh moment for me. But many, many, many years later, let's see, so how many years later? 20 years later, maybe, or so? Then my daughter came to me, and she had gone out in whatever area and picked some weeds and made a little bunch out of them and handed them to me. And it was so hard in that moment to be kind to her, to not repeat what had been done to me. But I knew that that wasn't what I wanted to do. I knew that I didn't want to repeat that same mistake, that same hurt. So when Kayla came and she gave me the flowers, I said, even though I didn't really think it so much at the time, it wasn't a lie per se, but it was like, "Oh, those are very nice flowers. Thank you." Right? I'm also thinking in my mind, they're also weeds, but okay, they're flowers. Nice. Right? But it was such a lesson for me also, that I didn't have to repeat the past, that I didn't have to enact that hurt, that I had a choice in this very small thing, which was, for her, she probably won't even remember that ever happened, right? Because it was just like, yeah, she gave me the flowers and it was nice and blah, blah, blah. And it's over for her. But for me, right, it was a pivotal moment. It was a shift. It was an effort. And it was a shift that I felt good about later. I could reflect on that and go, wow, yes, exactly. In that moment, I lived into what I really believe, what I really want, the impact that I would like to have in her life. I didn't have to do it the way that it happened to me. So I guess to sum up the talk this evening, one of the most important parts of the path is to be able to reflect on the impacts of what we do to ourselves and to others, and to reflect on that at all the time, basically, all the time, before, during, and after. Not with the intention of criticizing ourselves, but with the intention of really trying to align what we do and what we say and what we think with our highest aspiration, our aspiration to be, hopefully, our aspiration to be creating less greed, less hatred, less delusion in the world. It is possible. We can make those choices. We can step out of our social construct. We can step out of our personal history. We can step into a beautiful new relationship with each other, with the world, and with our own hearts, so that we feel better, so that we feel like we can feel the joy of that. Like my friend Gerardo, in his giant bags of tomatoes and squash and cabbage. So I hope you find that joy in your lives. Thank you.